I'm Brandi. Kruse. Coming up today on Undivided, our segment on King County Executive Dow Constantine sparks a national debate over the root cause of the homeless crisis. Plus, the Seattle Times highlights a gym's selective inclusivity, and Seattle's mayor decides to spend millions of dollars on something that absolutely will not reduce violence among youth. That and more coming up today on Undivided. Remember, you can support our show for just $5 a month by signing up at undividedpod.com. Hello, and welcome to Undivided. I'm Brandi Kruse. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. Boy, did we get the internet all in a little bit of a tizzy last week. So Dow Constantine, the King County executive, gave his State of the County address, and in it, he talked about the homeless crisis. How could you not? It's gigantic, so you can't really ignore it. But he said something I thought was downright ridiculous. Here it is.
One widely held belief is that behavioral health issues like untreated mental health or substance use disorders are root causes of the homelessness crisis that we see all around us. This is wrong. University of Washington researcher Greg Colburn has shown that the cause of the homelessness phenomenon is not individual challenges, but a housing market failure.
Okay, to which I thought that's ridiculous. He mentions a UW researcher. I don't need a researcher to tell me what I see with my own eyes. I don't need a researcher from UW to tell me what I've seen and what I've heard from people who are actually homeless. I don't need a UW researcher to tell me what we see service providers saying all the time. This is a drug crisis. This is a mental health crisis. And because people are either drug addicted or mentally ill, they wind up on the streets, and they could not keep a house or an apartment if they wanted to in a condition like that. So I thought that was just absurd. The internet thought it was pretty absurd too, because I could not believe how viral that one little clip of Dow Constantine went. I just posted his clip of him saying that, and holy SHIT a bunch of times. And it got, 4.9 million, almost 5 million views on Dow Constantine's little clip just over the weekend. What was interesting, though, is it wasn't just shared by a bunch of people who agree with me or agree with my assessment. There were some people who thought that what he said was totally based and that he's completely right, and this is absolutely a lack of housing. And it's so simplistic the way that he put it, saying, we have X number of homes and X number of people, so if there are too few homes, then these people will just live on the street and inject drugs into their vein and walk around the sidewalks nude screaming at people. Yeah, because that makes an awful lot of sense. But this is, and what I would also say, can you play, Nicole, the clip from Dow just one more time?
One widely held belief is that behavioral health issues like untreated mental health or substance use disorders are root causes of the homelessness crisis that we see all around us. This is wrong. University of Washington researcher Greg Colburn has shown that the cause of the homelessness phenomenon is not individual challenges, but a housing market failure.
Okay, so let's say that he's right. Let's say he's right and it is housing market failure. This is a problem with housing affordability. Who should we blame then? Should we blame the King County executive, who's been in office since 2009? Who's been in charge of the county's response to homelessness for 15 years? So if you're saying we have a housing problem and a housing shortage, what have you done over the past 15 years to make sure that's not the case? Obviously not enough, right? And if you're saying, well, you can't blame the King County executive, this is a statewide problem. Okay, that's fine. Should we blame the governor, who has been in office for 12 years, who belongs to a party that has controlled the governor's mansion for 40 years, who said this during his State of the State address last year?
The fundamental underlying challenge is that we do not have enough housing in our state for our people.
Okay, then why haven't you made it so that we have more housing in our state for our people? Again, operating off of your mistaken belief. And I don't even know if they actually believe that, or if they just know that they can get a lot more money from people if they put little measures on the ballot saying, hey, increase affordable housing, let us tax you. And that's just easier for them to do and to get money for their cronies. But again, if you have the King County executive who's been in office for 15 years, the governor who's been in office for 12 years, who replaced a governor of his political party, who replaced a governor of her political party, who replaced a governor of his political party, going all the way back to the 1980s, like, who do we blame here, right? That's a failure of your leadership and your brand of politics. But again, that's not the cause of homelessness. That's not the cause of the crisis that we are seeing on our streets right now. And it's shocking to me also, we're going to get into, I wanted to give, fair shot. Like Dow says, hey, it's a UW researcher and he has proven definitively that this is a failure of the housing system. So I was like, okay, I'll go dig into what this researcher is all about and I'll get to him in a moment. But, this simplistic idea of housing as a solution to homelessness, it's something that's also been pushed by the King County Regional Homelessness Authority that, has spent hundreds of millions of our dollars just for homelessness to increase by 23% year over year. We made fun of them kind of for this tweet on the show a while ago. They put out a graphic that just said, housing solves homelessness. Housing solves homelessness. And at the time I said, gosh, we're in trouble. If the entity that's job it is to figure out what's happening on our streets believes it's that simple, that housing solves homelessness. But why would they not say that? Because that's what the governor says. That's what the King County executive says. That's what the party in power says. But I would also say, and go back to this very simplistic understanding of, if we just put everyone in homes, we wouldn't have the crisis that we have right now. But we know that putting a roof over someone's head is a Band-Aid, and it's a temporary Band-Aid. If you do not acknowledge and address the underlying reasons why they didn't have a roof over their head in the first place. You might recall We Heart Seattle and Andrea Suarez, they had sent us pictures of a low barrier housing apartment that they'd gone into where a guy had a roof over his head, was in an affordable housing unit, but it was as if he was still homeless. He was defecating next to the toilet. He had graffitied all over the wall. He was still very much addicted to drugs. He was living in squalor and filth. So yeah, he had a house, he had an apartment, but his life was no better off than when he was living in a tent on the street. So when you say that housing solves homelessness, I guess that's true. If you're living in a house or an apartment, you're not houseless, you're not homeless, but nothing else in your life has improved. So is that what they want? Is that their measure of success for these people? Is it? That, hey, let's just get them off the street into shelter, and then we don't see them, and they're out of sight and out of mind, and they can die with a needle in their arm, in an apartment that they trash. That's fine. So if you look at it that way, housing solves homelessness. Okay, I guess that's technically true. But housing doesn't solve addiction. Housing doesn't solve mental health issues. And if you thrust someone into low barrier shelter, an affordable apartment, a tiny home, and they're still addicted to drugs or severely mentally ill, I promise you that they won't be able to keep a roof over their head for very long. And then what have you done? Nothing. Which makes a lot of sense because our government has been doing nothing for the better part of 15 years on this crisis. And that's why, since Dow Constantine declared that homelessness was a state of emergency in King County, in the 10 years since, homelessness has spiked more than 50%. Because they keep pushing this false narrative that, put a roof over their head. If you put them in a home, they're not homeless anymore. Well, they will be soon because you didn't fix anything else. And then you patted yourself on the back for it. And you called it empathy and you called it progressive. It's unreal to me that that's the party of progress, right? What kind of progress is that? So let me again dive into this. Greg Colburn, who's this UW researcher that Dow Constantine used to say that this is not a drug crisis or a homelessness crisis. It is a crisis that is the result of a housing failure. So Greg Colburn, UW researcher, but he also wrote a book about this, okay? He wrote a book about homelessness is a housing issue. And I watched this video this morning of him talking about the main point of his book. Here it is.
So the point of the book is to say, why do some cities have a huge homelessness problem and why do some not? Okay. And the punchline of the book is that housing market conditions, both the cost of housing and the availability of housing, is the best predictor of rates of homelessness on a per capita basis. Okay. And the book is focused at the city level or the region level, not at the individual level, right? And so a lot of homelessness research is focused on the individual and says if Greg were mentally ill or Greg took drugs or Greg was in poverty, Greg's more likely to be homeless. And that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And so these individual factors are certainly important, and we certainly see it when we're walking around and we see people who are addicted or mentally ill. But the research in the book demonstrates that it's not that we have more people with those vulnerabilities. We don't have more people with mental illness. We don't have more people who are addicted. We don't have more people who are living in poverty. In fact, we have less than a lot of other regions, right? But the consequences of those vulnerabilities in Seattle are much worse than they are in Chicago, Cleveland, or Detroit, where housing costs are much, much lower and vacancy rates are much, much higher, rental vacancy rates. And so the point is that if we focus on these individual vulnerabilities and say, we've got a drug problem in Seattle, then I don't believe we are ever going to solve this problem, because it's not a drug problem. Drugs certainly make it more likely that you'll experience homelessness, and that's more likely in Seattle than Chicago, but we can't treat our way out of this, right? Because ultimately we still have a huge deficit of housing.
We can't treat our way out of this. I think I understand now. I think I understand now the argument that they're making. And it is as simplistic as I thought when I first heard Dow Constantine say that. So what he's saying, we can't treat our way out of this because then we still have a housing shortage. So, if we treat the drug addict on the streets, we might not have a house or an apartment to put them in. So you just don't do it? So you just don't treat them? So it would be worse or the same, in your opinion, to just not treat them, okay, and put them in a housing unit? Like, that's a win for you? As opposed to, if we can't put them in a house, why treat their drug addiction? Like, let them at least keep using while they're living in a tent. So that's the mindset. When I hear that, when I hear Dow, when I hear Jay, when they see homelessness, when they see that word, they literally say, okay, if you have a home, you're not homeless anymore. So that's what they're saying. Their solution to fixing this issue is to put people, no matter what state they're in, no matter their ability to keep a roof over their head, to be able to hold down a job to pay bills, their idea of fixing the homeless problem is to make sure that no one is homeless. Now, they can be in a house, and they point to, some places in impoverished areas of the South where you have some pretty high addiction rates and have for a long time. But people still have, a trailer park or something that they live in. And they see that as a solution, as better somehow. Where I look at this and I say, I don't care if someone has a house that they're living in, an apartment, an affordable housing unit, whatever it is. If they still are deeply drug addicted or mentally ill, we have not bettered their circumstances at all. And to suggest that we are bettering their circumstances simply by putting a roof over their head is insane. And I point back to, again, that guy in the apartment that Andrea Suarez took pictures of, living in filth, feces on the floor, killing himself with drugs. Is it better because he does it inside four walls? I don't think so. And what this UW researcher is also failing to, I think, factor in to his research to sell his book are the policies and how allowable it is in a lot of West Coast cities to just let people live in filth and squalor right before our eyes and shoot up drugs right before our eyes and not put them in jail for it. There's an incentive there when you have a carrot and a stick and you have police going out and saying, you're not going to live here on the streets. You're not going to do this, or you're going to go to jail. There's an incentive there that makes them maybe wake up and say, okay, I've got to seek out treatment. I've got to do something better. I mean, in those areas of the South where people are drug addicted or whatever it is, and they're housed, they probably would be homeless if law enforcement in the South and politicians in the South let them do what we did here. And just, oh, no, that's fine. Like, no big deal. Hey, you do you, steal, rob, whatever you need to do to support your drug habit, whatever it is, or live on the street. Like, we're fine with that. We're not going to criminalize that. Yeah, those people in the South probably wouldn't have, found a trailer to live in or something like that. So it's this fundamental disagreement, I think, with what the homeless crisis means and what it is and what it's going to take to actually better their lives. Because let's look at it like that. That's how we should all look at it, right? How do we better this person's life? We have a person living in the streets in a tent. How do we make sure for the long term their life is better? Because it's not a better life to be living in an apartment and still be addicted to deadly drugs, suffering with mental illness. Now, if Dow thinks it is, then he needs to say that. If Jay Inslee thinks it is, then he needs to say that. Because that's very clearly not empathy. It's not solving any problems. And you're just going to have those people continue to cycle in and out of the system. It's also this matter for me. And there was a clip, speaking of the guy who was in this affordable housing unit, just living about as bad of a life as he had anywhere else. Andrea had also talked, we played this clip on the show a couple months ago. I'm in this position where I'm like, who do I believe? Who do you believe, Do I believe Dow Constantine, like the career politician, when he tells me what the homelessness crisis is? Do I believe Jay Inslee, the career politician, when he says from his mountaintop what the homelessness crisis is, from his multi-million-dollar house on Bainbridge Island, what the homelessness crisis is? Or do I believe homeless people who, if you've ever spoken to any in Seattle, will tell you that they're either drug addicted or mentally ill? There's this clip of Andrea Suarez asking a couple that came into the We Heart Seattle offices, hey, what's stopping you from getting a roof over your head?
Hey, you guys just walked into my office. I haven't seen you in a minute. It's been a few months, but I've known you since Denny Park when you guys were living in a tent in the park. Emily and Kevin. Emily and Kevin. And we're talking today about what is the number one barrier that's keeping you guys from affording an apartment? Is it high rent? What is the immediate barrier that's keeping you from taking the next step towards housing?
Drugs. Drugs. That's what it is. So I think, okay, do I trust the UW researcher? He's talking about, I've traveled all around the world and all this. Good for you, man. Like, good for you. Have you ever been homeless? So do I trust Dow? Do I trust Jay Inslee? Do I trust the UW researcher? Or do I trust people who are actually homeless in saying what their issue is and what's preventing them from moving forward with their life? On Sundays with Subscribers, we spoke to a man named Tim Emerson. Tim works for We Heart Seattle, but he's also a former drug addict. And I played for him this clip of Dow Constantine, and he reacted to it basically by saying that's not what we're seeing when we interact with these people out on the streets.
Well, let's just take a look at the housing that we're going into, these low barrier housing places that we have available. You go in, it's full of needles, and they're passing out the needles and the foils, and then they're getting kicked out constantly. It's kind of a rodeo inside. So it's a constant revolving door of the same people over and over because of that addiction and the untreated mental illness. They're going in and out of these doors. That they're there, they're just not staying in there.
Sorry. I just want to be clear. You're talking about people who've gotten housing, a roof over their head, but they are still addicted to drugs.
Yes. Yep. And we're not dealing with that issue at all. And then they're just slowly filtering back out the doors or dying behind the door. We're a boots on the ground agency here. I go out and I talk to these people. I know what the needs are. And I can tell you 100% of these people out there have been homeless, and they have been housed, and they have been homeless, and they have been housed, and they all have addiction issues. 95% of who I'm talking to are openly admitting that they have addiction issues and they need help with it, and they just don't know how.
Yeah, they don't have a government that's capable of helping them with it. That's Tim Emerson. You can watch our full interview from Sundays with Subscribers at undividedpod.com, undividedpod.com. I am much more apt to believe someone like Tim, who's out there doing this every single day and who understands that homelessness is not driven simply by a lack of available housing. No person in their right mind, if they cannot afford a house or an apartment, simply says, okay, well, I'm going to go live on the street then, and I'm going to inject drugs, and the drugs are going to turn into a mental health crisis, and then I'm going to be beyond saving. Now, do I think that there is the occasional case of someone who falls out of their housing, has no safety net with family or anything like that, and winds up homeless? Yes, I do. But I think that that is a fraction of a single percentage of the crisis that we're seeing. And again, if it is a housing crisis, if you disagree with me on that point, if you do believe it's a housing crisis, an affordability crisis, then answer me this: who's to blame? Who's to blame for it then? Would it not be the party in power and the politicians that have been in power for 3 terms or 4 terms while this crisis has worsened? So even if you agree with Dow, you would then have to turn around and blame Dow for the situation and how bad it's become. I would also note, when it comes to data on this issue is entirely faulty, because the way that they collect data is biased. It's unhinged, in fact. You know, they do these point-in-time counts. They do surveys of people who are out living on the streets. And we've talked about this on the show previously, but I thought it was worth revisiting. The King County Regional Homelessness Authority, one of these times that they went out and tried to collect information on, you know, how old were you when you first started living on the streets, and, you know, where are you originally from, and all of this. One of the survey questions was, what events or condition contributed to your experience of homelessness? And there's this long list of things that these homeless individuals could choose from. Lost job, eviction, foreclosure, incarceration, couldn't afford rent, family domestic violence, resettlement transition, death of a parent. Nowhere in there. There isn't even an option. And there's like 20, 25 options here. There isn't even an option for substance abuse. So it's like they either don't care to know the truth, don't want to know the truth. There isn't even an option. The single most obvious cause of homelessness, substance abuse. And there isn't even an option on here for them to select that. You know how many totally normal middle-class families and even upper middle-class families and parents I've spoken to whose child had everything they could ever hope for, a roof over their head, a family that loved them and was willing to care for them, that spiraled into addiction, usually, you know, through opioids or painkillers, wound up doing heroin, and then wound up doing fentanyl and wound up on the streets. So many. We've had people on on the show who had stable housing and would have continued to have stable housing if not for their drug addiction. So again, I'm going to bring it full circle by saying we cannot solve a problem that we refuse to properly identify. And the party that created these crises is not the party that is going to fix them. All right, coming up next, the results of a major audit find that 11 Washington government agencies mishandled over $1 billion in COVID funds. We'll dive into it. The segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. We've talked a lot on the show about audits. You know, there have been some demands for audits of programs that absolutely need them. The Housing Justice Project, the Restorative Pathways program that's supposed to be helping juvenile offenders get on a better track, but it's absolutely failing at that. And look, I don't understand why audits become so political and controversial. It's like, no, this is our money. You know, it's going to programs that we're supporting, some of us. And we would like to know that the money is being used well. What is controversial about this? And every time somebody demands an audit, it's like a Republican. Why don't Democrats demand audits? Especially the homeless one really bothers me too. You know, you look at the King County Regional Homelessness Authority spending hundreds of millions of dollars only for homelessness to increase 23% year over year. If you cared about the homeless people, truly cared about them, wouldn't you be like, hey, we need to audit that. Let's figure out what's working, what's not working. Where's all the money going? Why aren't we having any outcomes for the amount of money that we're putting into this? So it's so weird that audits are like a conservative issue. It's like a Republican issue. Now, I will give the state auditor a lot of credit. State auditor, this is a routine thing that they do, but they came out with this massive audit. It's like 1,500 pages. So, I mean, if you're really nerdy and you want to nerd out on the audit, go ahead and dip into it. But it came out and it found that 11 Washington government agencies mishandled over $1 billion in federal funds that came in as a result of COVID-19. Again, if you want to read the full audit, I'll even acknowledge that I did not read the full audit. But this was an audit for a period from July 2020 through July 30th, 2023. So kind of tail end of the COVID-19 pandemic and the money that was coming in. I just picked out three of many, many things that they found that had been mishandled. The Employment Security Department made improper payments to ineligible beneficiaries of the unemployment insurance program. The Department of Children, Youth, and Families did not have adequate internal controls over and did not comply with requirements to ensure payments to child care providers paid with temporary assistance for needy family funds. The Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction did not have adequate internal controls over and did not comply with federal reporting requirements for the Education Stabilization Fund program. So we had all this federal money coming in, a ton of it, and more than $1 billion of it either can't be accounted for, like there isn't proper accounting to even figure out if money that went out should have gone out to who it went out to, which is very problematic. Or you had these failures of internal controls to make sure that these agencies, from the Office of Superintendent to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families to the Employment Security Department, that there was like no internal protocols to make sure that they had clear standards in place for where the money was going, that the money was tracked so that when an audit happened, they would have all this in place. So our friends over at the Center Square did a good detailed article on this, reaching out to some of the agencies and the state auditor's office to get some context. It says a new report from the Washington State Auditor's Office found a record 86 issues with how 11 state agencies spent federal COVID-19 aid, noting documentation deficiencies and $1.17 billion in questioned costs in the fiscal year 2023. And again, that's just 1 year. And when they say questioned costs, so some of it's important to know they can't definitively prove it was misspent, but the record keeping is so bad that they can't prove it was spent well either, which is just as disturbing to me. It says the audit specifically looked at federal money being spent by the Washington government, which in the last fiscal year totaled over $29 billion. So $29 billion of that $1.2 billion kind of unaccounted for. It says Jim Brownell, Assistant Director of State Audit and Special Investigations at the Auditor's Office, pointed to the Washington State Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which had over $350 million flagged in the recent audit, which honestly doesn't surprise me. How big of a disaster has DCYF been? We've talked about so many issues with that agency. So the fact that that agency alone had over $350 million flagged as potentially problematic, that doesn't come as a surprise to me. I'm glad that the audit has it in black and white. It says, according to Brownell, the flagged spending was due to the issues with the department's accounting for child care payments. Auditors could not gather enough evidence to assess whether the payments were made appropriately, were appropriately accounted for, or materially complied with federal requirements. He said, so in this particular case, DCYF accounting was not up to standard, and we could not trace $350 million back to individual payments. They do high-level accounting adjustments. They move big batches of expenditures from one funding source to another, and we're just not able to audit them. It is problematic when the state auditor is unable to properly audit state agencies because their record keeping and their protocols are so bad that they cannot tell the state auditor's office where the money went and to whom and how much. That's crazy stuff. And then you have this government that has become more and more bloated over the last 10 years in particular. And these audits touch just a fraction of our government spending, just a fraction. So here they have this audit. Again, it's massive in scope, but it still accounts for only a fraction of the spending that our state government makes. Think of all these other areas that have never seen an audit, that don't see audits to this depth. Think of how much misuse, waste, fraud could be uncovered. I go back to the homelessness system. You cannot tell me that there is not severe waste in the King County Regional Homelessness Authority when you're spending as much money as they're spending and having no results. And then you look at even small things that have popped up over the years where there was never an investigation into it, like Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin hiring a crime czar? What was it? What was the official name that they gave Andre Taylor? Street czar.
Street czar.
It was a street czar,
Yep.
To connect police to the communities they serve. And this was one of the many government contracts handed out after the summer of 2020 and the rioting. Well, Andre Taylor didn't even really show up for work. And then they didn't renew his contract after 6 months because nothing was done and he didn't have anything to show for it. And then they just didn't talk about it really publicly. And it's like, oh, let's just sweep that one under the rug. And that accounted for not even $1 million, I don't think. But when you look at all these individual examples, the Housing Justice Project, which just wrote a $50,000 check for a guy that has refused to pay rent for 2 years, that was never intended to be the way that that money was used, both county funds and state funds. But it's being used that way anyway, and then they're not being audited. It's somehow political to want them audited. So you look at this one audit, $1.17 billion worth of maybe misspent funds. I don't know. They've just sort of vanished into thin air. And then you look at all these individual contracts that are given out with taxpayer funds that, for whatever reason, there's just not the political motivation to audit them. I think when you have have money that's sent out in the name of like social justice or racial justice, there's a hesitancy from Democrats to audit those funds, and that's all political, certainly. And then on the homelessness front, you have all these entities that are getting all this money, 6-figure salaries to work in the homeless industrial complex, and they want to keep that money coming in, and Democrats certainly want to keep giving that money to them. So there's just, again, not the political courage or desire to audit where all your money is going. Yet they continue year after year to come back to us and ask for more money. At some point, we have to say no. We have to tell them to kick rocks until they're willing to be accountable for the money, the vast amounts of money that they're already spending. It's ridiculous. All right, that segment was brought to you in partnership with our friends over at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Before we move on to our segment, Unbelievable, a double dose of it today. Oh, wow. Didn't take a breath there for a minute. Before we move on to our segment, Unbelievable, if you're looking to sell your home at some point in 2024, reach out to our friend Wes Jones of sellwithwes.com. Wes has been doing this in this market for a long time. He knows the market like the back of his hand. If you're living in an individual neighborhood, on the east side or something, there's a pretty good chance he's going to know some comparables in the area and be able to tell you how homes have performed. Bryce and Carla, who are fans of the Undivided podcast, they reached out to Wes Jones when they went to sell their home in Bellevue to retire to Florida, and they were very happy with the results.
Just very detail oriented and never put down our property, because you could hear I-90 from our property, and it wasn't the most feng shui, yummy piece of property, and our furniture never showed our house well, our own personal furniture. But he was like, oh yeah, he could see in his mind, this will show after the paint and the staging, this will be a premium property. He could see that, and he didn't let us feel like it was a subpar home the way it was, And others were like, oh, we're gonna have to put a water feature on that deck because that noise. And I'm like, sorry,
Yeah, so Wes was able to sell their home in 7 days for over list price. So again, reach out to our friend Wes Jones, sellwithwes.com. Start by using their home value calculator to see how much your home is worth. It might be worth more than you think. Sellwithwes.com, a better way to sell your home. All right, the Seattle Times did a feature on a gym on Capitol Hill that is all about inclusivity, unless you're a dirty, stinking pig. Let's talk about it in our segment, Unbelievable. All right, it is Pride Month after all, so Pride stories overfloweth in the Seattle news media, including in the Seattle Times, and they did a nice story on a LGBTQ inclusive gym. Seattle Gym's LGBTQ inclusive competition parties on despite trolls. Let me read from it for you, shall I? Okay. On its surface, the event is a competition for one powerlifting exercise, the deadlift. Over 3 different afternoon time slots, around 275 lifters, split into groups determined by their starting lift weight, will pull a bar laden with as much weight as they can manage from the ground and to their waists before setting it down. Wow, really detailed description of what a deadlift is. Thank you, Seattle Times. Unlike most weightlifting competitions, RCF's Pullapalooza organizers don't divide lifters based on their gender. The gym doesn't even ask when competitors register what their gender might be. Despite a broader political landscape hostile toward transgender athletes in competitive sports, the Capitol Hill-based gym gives everyone a space to compete. Through RCF, non-binary and trans athletes say they've found a connection they haven't always had with their bodies and affirmation in their various gender identities. RCF, which boasts its inclusivity in all of its events and papers, its gym spaces with LGBTQ+ and Black Lives Matter flags, Flags has received its share of negative business reviews and cranky comments from people who don't support the same ideals. But the team had never experienced anything like this. Despite the negative political environment toward gender-diverse athletes, Carr and RCF co-owner Ben Kollungsberg have only felt more inspired to create events that specifically include them. So this whole article is about this gym. It's called Rain City Fit on Capitol Hill. And they do all these events about inclusion. And some people have trolled them online, which I don't doubt. Like, that's fine, right? I mean, hey, if they're just trying to create an inclusive environment where people can lift, I like that they make it just any gender can compete. We're not going to separate you. We're not going to put the biological men with the girls for powerlifting. It's just one category. Just come in here, be included, lift however much you can lift. And let's just celebrate love and inclusivity. Unless you're a cop. Unless you're a little pig. Suey! You know? They walk in.
You have too much fun doing that.
Suey, piggy! If you're a cop, you're absolutely not welcome there. Because inclusivity, you have to have a line, right? You have to have a line. Inclusivity on gender, sexual orientation, race, background, all of those things. We welcome everyone except cops. So the Seattle Times, which this article, I should note, is written by Nathalie Graham, who is a former writer for The Stranger. So that gives you a little bit of context here. So when the Seattle Times first published this piece, the picture of it had Ben and Leanna, again, the co-owners of this gym. And Ben has an interesting shirt on. It says Rain City Barbell Club. Okay, that's fine. You know, Rain City Barbell Club. Cool, you know, it's a gym. That makes sense. Except the letters ACAB are strategically highlighted in blue. This is the main picture in the Seattle Times article. Rain City Barbell Club, ACAB, all cops are bastards. In the main picture in the Seattle Times article, celebrating a gym for its inclusivity. Now, I don't believe for one freaking second that this particular former writer for The Stranger turned Seattle Times writer didn't see that. I don't believe for one second that the Seattle Times, in its selection of this picture, didn't notice that. And didn't say, oh, we're all for inclusivity, but unless it's a stupid bastard cop, ACAB. But when I'm going to have some cops, hopefully didn't listen to this out of context today. But when the internet noticed and called the Seattle Times out for it, that's when they changed the picture to just these two gym owners sitting back to back with a barbell behind them that had like rainbow weights on it. So the picture has now been changed. But again, I do not believe for one second that Nathalie Graham, who wrote this article, who very clearly saw the shirt that he was wearing. Obviously, they were there taking multiple pictures. He's wearing the same shirt in the other picture that they have now changed it to, except the front of the shirt is not visible. I have no doubt that they saw it, they didn't care, they used the photo anyway, and had the audacity to paint this whole story, eloquent story about how inclusive this gym is. Because inclusivity for them does not mean that you can't have utter hatred and vitriol toward the police. Just another reason to cancel your Seattle Times subscription and subscribe to Undivided, undividedpod.com for just $5 a month. See what I did there? All right, double dose of unbelievable today. Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell gave in to Seattle Public School students who believe that more mental health counselors is the way that we're going to solve gang violence. Let's get to it. Oh, it's exhausting. So last week there was a horrible shooting at a high school in Seattle. Awful. And there was a kid who was trying to break up a fight, and he ends up getting shot. But it was very clear that there was some gang activity and some gang involvement in this. But, you know, we have elected leaders who refuse to bifurcate between, you know, random acts of violence at a school, for instance, like a school shooting, and a gang shooting that happens near a school, outside a school, or in a school. There's a big difference between, some mentally ill student who picks up an AR-15 and decides to go to school and kill as many people as he can because he just snapped one day, and a gang member who brings a handgun to school and encounters other gang members and wants to shoot one of them. There's a huge, huge difference there. But after this shooting happened, I don't doubt that kids were traumatized. Of course they were. Nobody would question that. But you see how these kids have been manipulated to believe that, solutions that not in a million years will solve gang violence are the path. And they make these demands, and then you have politicians who just give in to the demands. So Bruce here also, a couple of the students had come out and said, we need more mental health counselors. They walked out of classes and protested. We need more mental health counselors. And Nicole and I were like, what is that going to do? You think that the gang members are going to go see the mental health counselor at school who's going to convince them not to be gangbangers? I'm confused. I'm missing something here. But then you have Mayor Bruce Harrell who thinks, great idea. Let's spend $10 million on it. Let's not work on, I don't know, beefing up the gang unit, getting out there, trying to get these kids on a better path before they commit a crime like homicide. I don't know, throwing the book at gun offenders, teach them that there are consequences for their act. No. Let's have a $10 million mental health investment strategy. This again from our friends at the Center Square. Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell is directing an initial $2 million, so it's going to start as $2, toward violence prevention efforts in an executive order as part of a new strategy aimed at supporting youth mental health and safety. For the Seattle mid-year supplemental budget, Harrell intends to propose a funding allocation of up to $10 million for 2024 to begin delivering resources to support mental health and school safety. Out of the $10 million, $2.4 million would go toward initial telehealth services. Oh, okay, now you're not even going to go in to see the counselor in person. The gang members are going to go home. They're going to get on their laptop. They're going to Zoom on in, and they're going to talk about their issues with their school mental health counselor. That's ridiculous. Now, it does say that an additional $2 million would go toward violence prevention, although I need some more details on exactly what violence prevention means, because if there are ideas to prevent violence or anything like the ideas that they've had to date, I don't have an awful lot of confidence. I mean, you're talking about Seattle public school districts that don't even want school resource officers to be at school with kids. That's a pretty good way to prevent violence, or to at least have someone there in uniform with a gun, God forbid something were to happen. Harrell's new investment strategy will begin this summer ahead of the 2024 school year. The first mental health spending priority will be the $2.4 million for telehealth therapy services. According to the city, the funding will expand access to telehealth from 80 students currently to over 2,000 as efforts are further refined and scaled. Yeah, I have no issue with helping kids get more mental health. I think our kids are suffering severely, and I don't want to deny that, but that is not going to at all solve the issue of young gangbangers who are taking that violence from the streets into schools and into classrooms. So you have to treat them as criminals as early as you can. You have to throw the book at them as early as you can before they commit murder, before they take away a young person's life and ruin their own life forever. And until you're willing to treat it as a gang problem and not a gun problem, we're absolutely not going to get anywhere. Okay, coming up next in national, the polling for Trump in Iowa is insane. And I typically don't buy a lot into polling, but this is from the most reliable pollster out of Iowa. And the spread is so insane that the Biden team has to be incredibly worried about it. We'll dive into that. First, I've encouraged you guys to take the First Mark Challenge. All of us need insurance. The question is, are you going to handle all your insurance needs by yourself? Or do you want a company like First Mark Insurance to do it for free, to make sure you have the insurance you need at a price you can afford, and to revisit your insurance every single year proactively to make sure you're not paying for something that you don't need? So our friend Ben Bailey took the First Mark Challenge. He and his wife Leslie saved over $1,500 a year.
It's good to, just like you would go in for an annual physical with your primary care physician, you may not have anything wrong, but it's good just to kind of have that, annual check-in. And I think that's what First Mark, the service and the value that they really provide is it helps. It helps you have an understanding of your coverage.
Yeah, I took the First Mark Challenge. Mike and I did. We are now covered by through First Mark Insurance personally. The podcast is covered through First Mark Insurance. And Nicole now has her insurance through First Mark Insurance. And yes, it's because they're a sponsor on our show, but it's also because what they do and what they offer is miles better than what we were doing previously in handling all our insurance needs by ourselves. So firstmarkinsurance.com, firstmarkinsurance.com. Take the First Mark Challenge. It's totally free. Best part is they work for you, not the insurance companies. All right, dipping outside of Washington State, former President Donald Trump on the campaign trail as he awaits his sentencing on 34 felonies. I'm sure we're all eager to see how that plays out. He says on day one of his second term, if he's reelected, he plans to cut funding to schools who are pushing DEI and some of this extreme gender ideology.
On day one, I will sign a new executive order to cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, transgender insanity, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content onto the lives of our children. And I will not give one penny to any school that has a vaccine mandate or a mask mandate. And I will keep men out of women's sports.
Yep, love it. Check, check, check. Now, I don't know if he can single-handedly do all of that. You know, Congress controls the purse strings. There might be some stuff that he can do on an executive order basis. But I really think that DEI, what you have to do is get at the finances. I mean, DEI is such a poison on our country. It is the opposite of a meritocracy. You know, we shouldn't need, I mean, DEI is racism. It just is. But also, to me, it hasn't done anything for young students of color. I mean, we talk about this on the show all the time, except reinforce a victim mentality where they feel like there's nothing they can do to better their lives or their circumstances because of an immutable characteristic like the color of their skin. So we have seen in the fact, in the last couple of years, some universities moving away from DEI. We've seen some actions in Florida by Governor Ron DeSantis to sort of try to force schools' hands when it comes to these DEI programs and extreme gender ideology. And look, I do think, you know, I don't know, for instance, the extent to which President Trump could strip federal funding in our schools, because our state, depending on who the superintendent of public instruction is, but they would never strip out DEI under some threat from President Trump. I just don't know to the extent that he could force that issue on them. So it's something interesting. I mean, I really believe that a winning issue this November that more Republicans should be talking about is this transgender sports issue. I get it that, like, if you're trying to win in a state like Washington, right, where Republicans are pretty moderate, where it's a blue state, so you have to try to appeal to the middle and you don't want to get into those social issues too much, I actually think that's a winning issue. I really do. I think that is an issue that can speak to the heart of suburban moms and dads who are sick of watching, you know, their kids be eviscerated by someone who they can't biologically compete against, or who are just understanding that that's utter nonsense and ridiculous. So I just don't think it's an issue that Republican candidates in this state need to tap dance around. I really don't. Do you, Nicole? I feel like the amount of people we've had on to talk about that issue, and they're reasonable people who aren't like super conservative or something like that, I feel like go full in on that.
No, I think so. I think you're right, because more people are parents first than Democrats. They're parents first, and they care about their kids. And so I think a lot of people won't say their opinion all the time because they want to be PC and want to be protective of their whatever. But I think parents first. I think once you have a child in front of you, you're a parent first.
And if you've seen it happen or it could happen to your kid, I mean, I get it that the number of actual sporting matches and races or whatever it is where there's a biological male competing against girls, I get it that it's not as common as the opposite. Like, there's not as many of them, but we hear about these cases.
But it's getting more common.
But it's getting more common. And if you have a child in athletics in Washington State, this is an issue that has come up. This is an issue that you have an opinion on. I just refuse to believe that any parent who has a child in high school athletics does not have an opinion on this issue. That's very strong. And they might not say it publicly.
Right.
But they might hear, a Dave Reichert talk about it and be like, it's Dave Reichert, and then they can tell their liberal friends that they voted for Bob Ferguson or whatever it is. But I really do believe that most parents, I would venture to say, this is a complete guess, but I feel like a lot of polling is. Anyway, 90% of parents agree with us. That's my guess.
So.
90%. Maybe more. Let's take that to the bank. That's polling by Brandi. All right. So we're going to get into what's going on with Biden and what's happening in Iowa with polling. But I just have to say, I try hard not to, I never want to poke fun at Joe Biden for his age. But that doesn't mean that his mental state is not a serious issue that we absolutely have to keep talking about. There's all these videos that have been coming out of Biden just seemingly wandering off into nowhere, world leaders having to corral him. And then he was at this event with Obama, a Los Angeles fundraiser, and he's just completely lost, doesn't even know where he is. And Obama has to go back and wrangle him up. Like, come on, grab him by the hand. He's got him by the wrist. Come on, old Joe. And he leads him completely off stage. How embarrassing is this? I mean, it's embarrassing for the country, right? But it's really sad. It's stupid. It is insane that this is still the person who they're trotting out as someone who could serve 4 more years in office. Like, we're to that point where we realize that's not possible, right? I mean, I'm not saying, I'm not wishing anything upon the president, but the man deserves some peace in what I believe are his final years. Mm-hmm. I hate to say it like that. I really do. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he has a long, long life ahead of him, and him and Jill can do whatever they want to do, but he needs to do it in retirement outside of the White House. And so I just continue to go through this roller coaster in my mind of what's going to happen between now and November. You know, people want to say, who are you voting for, Trump or Biden? I'm not even sure either of them are going to be able to run. Like, I don't even know what's going to happen to Trump with his sentencing. And then Biden, I don't know if he's going to be alive. And come on, that's just the truth. So I don't know what they're going to finagle. Nicole had heard some rumor that maybe they're going to, like, Kamala Harris is going to say she's going to run for governor of California, and that'll let Gavin Newsom. Anyway, I don't care. The bottom line is that man, I feel horrible for him. It's absolutely elder abuse. And I do believe that is factoring into how badly he's doing in the polls. Because reasonable people say that, and they're like, I can't vote for that guy. I can't vote for that guy. Give me an option of someone who has like at least 10 years left in them. At least 4. So there's this Iowa poll, and what I think is interesting about this is, and again, I don't like try to read too much into polling. Polling was ruined for me in 2016 when they said Trump had a 1% chance of winning and then won the presidency. But apparently this is a poll by the Des Moines Register and Ann Selzer, who's been characterized as the most reliable pollster in Iowa. And it shows, this is insane, it shows Donald Trump with 50%. This is from the Des Moines Register. Trump maintains big lead over Biden and RFK Jr. despite his felony conviction, Iowa poll shows. So it has Donald Trump at 50%, Joe Biden at 32%, RFK Jr. at 9%, and only 3% unsure. I think that's what's significant here. Only 3% are unsure. And compare that to Washington State, where there's been polling on the gubernatorial race. There's a huge chunk of people who are uncertain. 3%. People in Iowa know who the freak they're voting for. And 50% of them say that they're voting for Donald Trump. And I was reading some Iowa-based analysis on this, which basically, when you look at Iowa, and a point that was made is, like, there's no way that if Trump is up 18 points in Iowa, he doesn't also win Wisconsin and Michigan and those Midwestern swing states. So that's, again, like, polling isn't perfect, but 18 points, 50% with almost no one who's undecided is incredibly significant. It also tells me that people have just been galvanized when it comes to Trump's felony convictions. If you've been with Trump that long, the felony convictions weren't going to do anything for you. And in fact, that's one of the factors why I have gravitated more toward Donald Trump, because you kind of start to understand and see the extent to which this whole system is trying to keep him from being president. What voters want be damned. But 50% in Iowa and 32% for Joe Biden is really significant. And I have to wonder, I feel like those RFK votes go to Trump. Right. And there's also 2% in there for Chase Oliver, the Libertarian candidate. Those don't go to Biden. No. So I feel like RFK Jr., Chase Oliver, that goes to Trump. Much more aligned. And if you're already not going to vote for Biden, who's in office, you have a significant reason for not doing so. Just wild. And also, there was a favorability, right? Mm-hmm. Favorability ratings are also very telling. So pluralities of Iowans view Joe Biden and Donald Trump very unfavorably. Iowa adults were asked, it says, I'm going to mention the names of some people in the news. For each name I read, please tell me if your feelings towards the person are very favorable, mostly unfavorable, or very unfavorable. Yeah, so 50% for Joe Biden, are very unfavorable. Very unfavorable. And Trump's aren't great either. 37% very unfavorable, 10% mostly unfavorable, but they're still better than Biden's.
And I think that's, I would say that that's flipped, right? I think that for a while, Trump was very unfavorable, whether you were going to vote for him or not. You didn't like him. And well, I mean, there was
still a lot of people who are going to vote for him and don't like him.
But I think that Biden is getting less and less likable even, which that was all I think he had going for him, is that people liked him more.
Yeah. Well, and his combined unfavorability rating, 66%, where Trump's combined unfavorability rating is 47%. So there's a significant difference. Then I'd also say when you look at very favorable, only 10% say Joe Biden is very favorable.
Right.
28% say Donald Trump is very favorable. I think with Trump, though, the magic with him is you don't have to like him to vote for him. You don't have to like him to vote for him. We see that, right? I think there are a lot of people who vote for Donald Trump who don't like him, but understand that of the options and of what's happened between his presidency and Joe Biden's presidency, and from a policy perspective, you kind of have to just grin and bear it.
But I also think that people are beginning to see that, like you just said, they're beginning to see that it's more of this machine going after him and less about him, really. And I think it's always been that. It's always been... I mean, he doesn't say things correct all the time. He's not the most PC person, and he's not the most, business, he's not, I don't know. He just doesn't present himself in the way that we'd like a president to present himself.
That typically we see as presidential.
Right. But in general, I think we now are seeing this machine go after him and how they create what they wanted to create. And people are done with it. They don't like him less. They like him more.
Well, and it's kind of exhausting, right? It's like the crying wolf thing, where it's every little thing he does. And it's like, okay, had they held back a little bit of their utter disdain and focused on big things that he had done that were questionable, we might be in a different position. But it's that, like, every single day, something else. There's a little bit of exhaustion there.
Seeing through it.
It's not so much, I want to clarify my position on this. It's not so much that I don't think Trump has done things worthy of criticism or even worthy of prosecution. But it's the media elevating all of that while ignoring things that Democrats have done. So it's this totally different standard. I use, and I'm going to talk about this more on the show tomorrow, but a local example is Bob Ferguson. Okay? So you looked at back to back to back to back Seattle Times stories into things Dave Reichert was caught saying on the campaign trail, right? And full-fledged Seattle Times news articles on it. And then Bob Ferguson asked the Secretary of State to break the law, not a peep. So to me, that is way more serious than any of the stories against Dave Reichert for his political or religious beliefs. But like Bob Ferguson asked the Secretary of State to break the law for him, election interference, and the media is like, no big deal.
Well, I think it's a difference of morality versus legality, right? So we've got these Democrats that are breaking the law, and I mean, there's a few things that Trump has probably broken the law or like gone around or tried to get away with. I agree. But for the most part, people care more about his morality and are more upset by his morality or have been. And now they're just less and less. Now they're like, okay, wait, this guy is lying to us. This guy is, we see the Democrats breaking laws.
Like family making millions of dollars overseas, all that stuff. Right. And so, that's what frustrates me. Now they're starting to, pay attention to Hunter Biden and stuff. It's like, after years of suppressing legitimate Hunter Biden stories.
I actually just think they're doing that because they're distracting from Joe. That's a distraction from Joe.
That's a good point. Or they want to be like, no, the system isn't rigged because look, Hunter Biden got this gun conviction. So it's like throwing that out there now after all of these years. But if you had... And you're right on the Reichert Trump or on the Reichert Bob Ferguson thing, because the stuff that the Seattle Times is relentlessly reporting on all this stuff, it's like Dave Reichert saying his personal belief is that marriage is between a man and a woman. Okay, he's not going to change anything about that politically, but that's his personal belief. That's where the whole long article and they, Dave Reichert did a Cairo radio interview, and it was like them talking at him about like, how dare you support maybe Trump? Like, why won't you tell us if you'll vote for Trump? They'll dedicate that much airtime to demanding to know whether he's going to vote for Donald Trump. But how much airtime are they dedicating to having Bob Ferguson on to answer for why he told the Secretary of State, bullshit, you can push the envelope, when the Secretary of State said he wouldn't break the law for him? Right. Like, there's no equal treatment there. And if there were, I don't know that we'd be in this situation. So like Trump, I don't think he's a particularly moral guy. I don't. But if the media covered all the things the Biden family had done with as much earnest and as frequently it wouldn't seem like there was this big disparity because they're all crooked and corrupt. Wild stuff.
Right.
Anyway.
It's crazy.
Just
crazy. I wonder when it's going to change.
Vote.
I wonder, I really wonder what 2028 is going to look like, because it can't be either one of them, right? So what's that going to look like? I'm kind of excited.
I don't care. I'll be on an island by then. No phone, no internet. Nothing. I'll still talk to you guys though. I'll send carrier pigeons.
So do I not have a job in 4 years?
Yeah, so you should plan for that. I'll send carrier pigeons with my takes on things from the island. All right, our friend Zach Abraham with Bulwark Capital, he's having another one of his Know Your Risk seminars. Know Your Risk seminars coming up on June 27th. So these are totally free. You can do them online. Go to knowyourriskradio.com. It's happening at 3:30 p.m. on June 27th. If you go to knowyourriskradio.com, it just pops up and you can register for the live webinar. But this time he's specifically going to focus on inflation and the impact that can have on your retirement planning and portfolio. He did one of these inflation seminars last month. It was really popular, so he wanted to turn around and do another one if you missed the first one. So with everything happening, looming election, global unrest, rising cost of living, crazy market volatility. So it's important to protect your retirement portfolio, but also to make sure that what you're saving is going to go the distance for you, especially with inflation. Can you still live the kind of life in retirement that you'd planned for with this runaway spending and the inflation that it's caused? So you can learn all of that on this webinar. Go to knowyourriskradio.com, knowyourriskradio.com. Sign up for it today, totally free, June 27, 3:30 p.m. Pacific time. Investment advisory services offered through Trek Financial LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Investments involve risk and are not guaranteed. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Trek 24244, go to knowyourriskradio.com. All right. Before we get to your comments for the day, I want to get to our daily subscriber show poll because it was something I was thinking about this weekend. Like, what makes some campaigns and candidates like take off to the moon and other ones just absolutely not gain any traction? What is it really? And so I asked you guys in our daily subscriber show poll, what do you believe is the biggest factor in determining whether a campaign or candidate gains traction? Is it simply their message and their personality? Like they've got good ideas, they're great at articulating it. Is it their name ID and media coverage? So how much actual recognition is there of their campaign? Or is it simply come down to money? Is it funding and is it resources? Let's see what you guys said. I'm going to start over on locals. Let's see. Over on locals, Esquam Videri says, none of the above is a singular choice. We are so tribal these days. What letter is behind your name is primary. Secondary is name recognition. Third is message. But what I would say to that is, even in primary races, though, like if you have a Semi Bird and a Dave Reicher, what makes one campaign take off and the other campaign sort of flounder when you have candidates of a particular political party? Shirley says, I'd like the answer to be messaging and personality, but history and reality insist that media has incredible power to influence voters' thinking, whether they tell the truth or form a false narrative. And yeah, whether they talk about, when you look at the media landscape right now, there haven't been a lot of, for instance, mainstream media stories on all the scandals around Semi Bird. I really think that's because they just don't see him as a viable candidate. So they're just sort of like, we're not going to waste our time and attention on that. We're going to talk about this Bob Ferguson, Dave Reichert matchup. And so certainly the media doesn't do any, well, actually, ignoring him in that case probably does Semi Bird favors because, news of some of the stuff that he's done doesn't reach such a wide audience. Kayla Smith says, I think reality is simply that to get your message, personality, and name out there, you have to have the funds and resources to make that happen. And that's true, because you could have a great message, great ideas, awesome personality, but if no one's seeing it, then your campaign's not gonna go anywhere. So I tend to go with funding and resources of all the options. Do you have the backing, the contributions, and all of that to be able to get your message out to folks? Let's see. Lisa Davis should be messaging and personality, but it's name recognition that makes people color in the circle at the last moment when they don't know candidates or their record. That's true, and I've done that. I've looked at a list and been like, that guy's name sounds familiar, and I don't know if it's for a good reason or a bad reason, but I'm like, haven't done it in a while. More informed voter than I once was. Let's see. Julie B says, media coverage and money spent. Can I clear up a misnomer on media coverage? So people really believe that there is a rule that the media has to cover campaigns equally. There absolutely is not. It's called equal time doctrine. That has nothing to do with media coverage. That has to do with advertising. So this is a quick little lesson for you. For anybody who's ever thought that, oh, my candidate, don't you have to give them time as well? No. Now, the media should. If you're interviewing one viable candidate, like let's say it's a Democrat, you should also offer airtime to the other candidate to do an interview and talk about the issues. So the media should, but there is no mandate by any means. The equal time doctrine essentially is if I sell advertising, a minute of advertising for $20,000 to Bob Ferguson, then I have to, by law, allow Dave Reichert's campaign to buy the same amount of advertising for the same price. So I can't, as a media entity, sell Bob a minute for $100 and then charge Dave Reichert $100,000 for the same minute. You can't do that. So that's the equal kind of time and cost. But when it comes to the media, we can interview whoever we want, whenever we want, for whatever reason we want. Again, you try to be fair, but if there's a candidate that's not out there actively campaigning, they're not fundraising, they have like no support, I'm not going to artificially inflate their campaign by virtue of using all of my resources and time and audience. So there is sort of, when I was in mainstream media, if you've got like 20 candidates for a single race, I'm not going to go interview all 20 candidates. No, I'm going to interview the candidates who have the experience necessary to do the job, who are running serious campaigns, who've raised some money, who've shown that they have some grassroots support, who, are previously held elected office. So yeah, the equal time doctrine, it's amazing how many times a week someone says, don't you have to interview so-and-so? It's like, no, I don't. No. And if they've got to do their own thing, lift their own campaign, and then when they get some traction naturally, sure, we'll have them on the show. Right?
Yeah, I think the Semi and Reichert situation throws a wrench in this polling, because in general we would say, Reichert has most of the party's support, so he has the most money and that's why he gets the most attention. But in this case, I think that Semi has some party support that's been able to boost him, and I think he got it before the nomination, boosted him, got him the nomination because of the drama, but he still has no money, and so you won't see the commercials, you won't hear his name, see his name, and you won't see the Seattle Times or anybody else take it seriously because they see the real support as opposed to the
artificially inflated support from a small group of people that's loud on social media.
But it's different because I think in the past it would be whatever the party is throwing their support at.
Right.
But in this case, it's not.
Yeah.
I think in the past it absolutely would have been like, whichever I said, Brandi, you can't run for office until you're a Republican because you won't get the support you need.
Yeah.
But maybe that's changing. Maybe this is the beginning of that change, because it doesn't necessarily mean you get the funding, but it doesn't necessarily mean you don't lose the name recognition.
Because on the governor's race, on that scale, I don't know if we've had an example of at least in recent memory, of a candidate who did not get their party's endorsement, but who went on to become the governor, win a primary election, for instance. So,
but it's showing how far people are leaving the party, and I mean the party is saying, hey, support this guy, give him the money, and the people and businesses are saying, nope.
No, they don't see it as realistic.
Yeah. And that has not happened to this extent before.
That's why, I've used the phrase in the Semi-Bird campaign always, oh, you're disgusting, Brandi. I called them a circle jerk. And they were like, you're gross. Okay, I'm not literally suggesting that they're sitting around in a circle pleasuring each other.
It's that Urban Dictionary
that's
versus...
the Urban Dictionary definition. No, now I got to pull it up just to tell people what a circle jerk definition is, but it's basically like that idea. It's a situation in which a group of people engage in self-indulgent or self-gratifying behavior, especially by reinforcing each other's own views or attitudes. And that's what you're seeing this relatively small circle jerk where they have convinced each other that they've got this big movement, and they're all feeding off of each other's energy for it. Similar with Lauren Culp. That's what happened with the Lauren Culp campaign as well. You had the same 300 people coming to every single rally, and they're like, wow, look at these huge rallies. It's like, nah, that's mostly the same 300 people who are coming over and over, because I'd go to multiple ones and see the same people. So it's this you're creating your own hype. It's like you're your own hype man, but you're not seeing reality. You're not seeing what it is. And that's what happened with the party preference process. Is Semi-Bird did a good job. His He had no long game. He had a short game. He wanted to get the party nomination, believing that it would somehow propel him forward. Right. And Dave Reichert was looking at November and Bob Ferguson all along. So, Semi Bird did a good job at getting the delegates, making sure they were Semi Bird supporters, and then getting that support. But you're talking about 1,900 people that are hyper party loyalists and that are not reflective of the voting population.
And
so,
I mean, that's
circle-jerk.
Supporting what we have been saying and what we've been seeing, where the majority of the country is in this independent zone. Yeah. And although Dave doesn't say he's independent, but I mean, he definitely is more moderate in his beliefs. And so it's like the party went extreme with Semi Bird, and the people are going more moderate and independent, like with Dave Reichert. And it just kind of, it's an interesting temperature here. I think they should be paying more attention to it as a representative of the country.
Well, also, maybe your party's irrelevant now, and that's how you kind of move past it. I don't know. All right, comments. Weiss Castle. Researcher found a strong correlation between expensive housing markets and high levels of homelessness, but I don't think he proved causation. And it just so happens to be, but also on the housing front. Some of the most expensive places to live in the country are progressive states and cities. They have their policies have made it so that it's unaffordable. You look at taxes and all these things that result in a higher cost of housing. I mean, look at what they're trying to do with natural gas. Look at the regulations that they put on builders. The time to be able to get permits, all of that adds to the cost of housing. And so I guess when you could talk about causation, well, like you caused that, you caused that. And then your policies have also contributed to this proliferation of substance abuse and mental illness and all of that as well. So no matter what you actually think the problem is, the same party is to blame for it. And that's consistent up and down the West Coast. Kim Taylor, Constantine cherry picks one UW study. What do the other studies say? Again, I don't even need a study. Like I'll listen to the homeless couple that says, oh no, it's drugs. I'll listen to Tim Emerson, who used to be an addict himself, who talks to homeless people all the time, who says, it's drugs. It's mental illness. I'll take that 10 times out of 10 over some UW professor who's trying to sell his book.
Why doesn't Dow go out with the Andreas?
Yeah, I think he has been once. I think he has been once. I think so.
With Ehart?
It's been a while.
I don't know how you can walk away from that and say, oh yeah, it's just because they don't have someplace to live.
Stupid.
They've got to make a mess here.
Yeah, Tim Clemenson says, okay, if substance abuse and or Tim Clemenson on his interview. Okay, is that a comment from Tim Clemenson or about it? What is that?
No, it's from Tim. And saying, okay, if substance abuse, he's asking a question. Oh,
if substance abuse and mental health aren't an issue, why is so much money being spent on addressing the two? Yeah, that's a good question. And it's not an either or, right? I'm not saying availability of homes isn't an issue. It's an issue for the working class. It's an issue for homes that have two full-time workers that are bringing home a salary and they still cannot make the leap to being a homeowner. So 100% housing affordability is an issue. I don't want you to mistake that. But you're looking at a whole system of problems, but that are being worsened very clearly by substance abuse and mental illness. And if you don't solve those, it doesn't matter if we have 1 billion empty homes. Because I've said this about my own dad. Like, he died in a cheap motel room. If we put him in a house, he would have just died in a house. So would putting him in a house have done anything for him? No, that's not empathy. Matt Gilbert, need to ask Dow to show us the person who is clean and sober and sound of mind, who is homeless and not taking up the resources out there. Exactly. If you truly are like someone fleeing domestic violence with some kids, you can get help like that. You look for help, you get help like that. And if you can't, and we're spending billions of dollars, then that's shameful. That's shameful. There's no reason that anyone who's sound of mind, not addicted to drugs, simply can't afford a place to live, could not be in some sort of shelter situation instantaneously. So yeah, Dow, give us one example. You provide us with, we'll do the interview with the homeless person who is homeless only because they cannot afford a place to live. So we'll challenge Dow to that. Find that person, bring them to us. All right. Alita Woodworth. President Johnson tried that when I lived in California. He got acres of old apartments torn down and replaced them with new ones. It ended up looking just as trashy within a month or so, as they were still drinking and drugging. And this was in the 60s. Not working on the underlying problem will guarantee failure, especially if the housing is free. Yeah. And putting them in a house that they can only... We did a story a couple months ago on the fact that low barrier housing and like low income housing, they have a crisis of eviction because people are still in low barrier, like low rent housing, and they can't afford it, even though rent is just a fraction of what it would be,
right?
Because they can't keep a job because they're dealing with drug abuse or mental illness. Vivian Eason, the governor's policies have made building affordable homes impossible. The new energy requirements in Washington add at least $30,000 to build a home. That's what I was talking about. You've made it impossible. You can't build affordable housing if affordable housing isn't affordable to build. And so the government has done this under Democrats.
They keep doing, I mean, their goal is to keep doing this.
Right.
Vote different.
Gas, 100%. Like you're going to ban natural gas
already.
and then you're going to make it even more difficult to buy a home. This makes no sense. On Trump and Biden, Teresa Jean, amen, sister, can't stand Trump, but I'll vote for him. DC Bindwell says, I can't wait for the debates. Will there be debates?
I think these will be the most highly rated debate. This will be the most highly rated debate ever. Because I don't know how Biden can make it through. I don't know if there's enough drugs to prop him up,
honestly, though,
to that extent.
They do absolutely drug him up because the State of the Union, he was like, went from just like can't find his way out of a paper bag to like gave a pretty coherent State of the Union.
Right.
I mean, I'm not talking about the actual content of it, but delivery was fine.
The State of the Union he was reading, and he's not going to be able to read this. So he'll mumble jumble the whole thing. I'm pretty convinced.
He can't read it. Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
Because he'll start spouting off all the things that he's been said, and he screws them up every time.
All
The things he's been told. And he just will mumble jumble the whole thing like I sometimes do.
It'll be an event for the ages. I wouldn't want to be the debate moderator at any of those.
Or would you?
Or would I? Maybe. All right. Good comments per the usual. With that, let's get to our closing sanity check. Boop. I had to add a boop because somebody was mad that in the double dose of unbelievable I did no boops. Look, I do that, but if it's a serious story or I'm really enraged, I'm not going to be like, also boop, so you can boop. All right, this is quite the clip. Chicago's mayor was asked about $30,000 in potentially misspent campaign funds, $30,000 that he spent on hair and makeup. Here is the rationale.
About the Sun-Times story last week about your spending of $30,000 from your campaign fund for hair and makeup. Can you respond to that and explain why you think that's an appropriate use of the campaign dollars to what to many people seems like a lot of money?
I think it's always appropriate to make sure that we're investing in small businesses, especially minority-owned, black-owned, women-owned businesses. Our campaign spends money on food. We support black and brown-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, printing. There are a number of things that my campaign spends dollars on. And I'm so committed to supporting small businesses that even as mayor, just made another announcement of another $35 million available for small businesses. That's important to people, that we lift up, small businesses that, in particular, that don't always get the attention and support that they deserve it. And so we're going to continue to do that as a city, and we'll make sure that, I encourage all of you in this room, support small businesses. Go get your hair and makeup done by black people in particular.
I don't even spend $30,000 on hair and makeup in a year, and I have a hell of a lot more hair than him and a hell of a lot more makeup on as well. Unreal. That has been your sanity check for today. That has been today's episode of Undivided. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for your commitment to giving common sense a comeback. We sure do appreciate every single one of you. If you have not subscribed to support the show already, it's just $5 a month. undividedpod.com, undividedpod.com. You can catch our episode, yesterday's episode of Sundays with Subscribers, where we had 2 people with quote-unquote lived experience respond to Dow Constantine's comment that homelessness is simply a housing issue. So, undividedpod.com. We'll see you back here on the live show tomorrow at noon.